even as we shift over to more digital items, but we have to think about digital items too. So what do we mean we talk about the role of the collection, not only within our array of services, but also in our community? And this is where I really like to, to me, it's not collection development. It's really making community connections with what we're purchasing or accepting as donations. So think about what role the collection plays. You can think about it in terms certainly of individuals who use your library, whole groups who may use your library, say daycares, for example. But also, how is it viewed? How I can guarantee funders and others who may not use the library are making those connections. So we want to make sure they're making what I would say is the right connections. So first and foremost, the collection is part of the whole of what the library does. And I learned a long time ago that most of the time you don't get to add on to your library. You don't get to build a new library every day. So the footprint of your physical library building is what you have. So you have to be very thoughtful about what goes in there. And so it's always evolving. My experience has been it's always evolving between three things, and that is people space, collection space, and technology space. And I was lucky or unlucky enough to start as a baby librarian when technology was just coming in. And what we did was we took away all the people space to put in the technology. We didn't look at the collections because why would you? That's just natural. That's what we do, right? So in the 90s anyway, that's what happened. But then there was the whole conversations around third place. And so besides home and work, where's that third place that you hang out, feel comfortable, want to be? And of course, the library was a natural for some people, and other people didn't think of us that way. So how do we get them to start thinking about us? Well, you can't really do that very well if you have no people space. They can't really hang out. They can only come in, get what they want, and leave, which means it's harder for you to do in-house services, right? And the collection is really a takeout service, if you will. So looking at that overall, what does that look like now? Is that something that needs to change a little bit? We've continued to evolve our technology space as more people want people space because they're using our Wi-Fi and not our physical computers. We saw people who do that, but we have more than halved that space in the 10 years that I've been here. Another piece of your snapshot is who uses the library, but more importantly, who doesn't. Many people will tell you, you need to be out there and getting more and more people to use your library. Totally don't disagree. But there are people who will not use the library, and understanding who they are and why they don't, and why you may not be able to capture that 10, 20% of your population who may not want to use the library or use it only in an emergency or, those kinds of things. So understanding why they don't, and I'll talk a little bit about advocacy here for just a second. Another thing that I learned early on in my career is sometimes people who don't use the library but strongly support having a library and a strong library in their community are equally as important speaking out as the people who actually use the library. So to me, it was becoming a director I appreciated the people who didn't use the library but still spoke for the library because it was important. They had money to buy books for themselves, their children, grandchildren, things like that. But they knew it was critically important, their kids coming here after school, using the space, things like that. So when I say who isn't, yes, if there are people you should be reaching out to, absolutely you need to think about that. And is there something for them in the collection? But it's not going to be everybody, and that's okay, in my opinion. But it's also important to know who is using your library, not make assumptions about them, not make assumptions about their reading, not make assumptions about why they're using the library, any of those things. So this is really coming from a neutral space and observing and collecting data. So you need to collect data from census. You need to know who's in your community. What does your school district say about how many languages are being spoken both there and at home? That's going to give you a little insight. And certainly any data you can pull from your ILS will help you back up those anecdotal, boy, here, interestingly enough, we don't have a lot of romance readers, which totally bucks the rest of the world because romance is one of the most popular genres, and we just don't have quite as much. It's on the upswing with many of the contemporary romance authors who have now come out in the last couple of years, but it was more of a wonderment to me than a criticism, right? And I'm not going to continue to buy tons and tons of romance when I don't have that. So I had to drill down further to find out the romance readers I had, what type of romance were they reading versus what was just popular everywhere. So the community snapshot is critically important. Bethany, do you want to talk real quick about, is it Compass?
Yes. So Minnesota Compass is a website. Let me bring it up and I'll put it in the chat. But the Wilder Foundation supports and maintains Minnesota Compass, and it's a place that you can go to find all kinds of demographics about your community. Now, if you're in a really small community, it's a little bit harder. You may have to look at the county level, but you can find out information like traditional things like population numbers, like you would expect, but also what languages are being spoken, what the employment rate is, and what types of employment people have in your community or in your county. So I will put that in the chat, Michelle, and then you guys can take a look, kind of, if you want, while we're talking about this very topic. So
Wonderful. Thank you, Bethany.
yeah.
So we really have to know kind of the history of our collection as well. So looking at the past, even the more recent past, and then the currently what's going on, but also what's happening in the community, how that's evolving. Compass is a good place to, and your school district is a good place that really is closer to the heartbeat of your community about who's there and what's going on. And we just have to accept that sometimes we don't always know, but most of the time, our communities and therefore our collections are evolving. There's not this enormous leap that is happening, but sometimes there's a large leap. And I'll go back to the 90s and the technology. That was a no and then yes. And how did we handle that and how do we deal with that? And that's sometimes true of your collection as well. It's not as clear always, but keeping your finger on the pulse and so you can do some of this evolution and that will help mitigate some of those large leaps. We need to get rid of all of this, but we need all this new stuff because the next is true no matter how large your library. I can guarantee you that New York Public and Los Angeles Public still have budget constraints. They can't buy everything. And so you have to look at that. So evolving, meaning you're buying a few books and a few books more, knowing how your community is evolving and how people's reading habits, they may not have evolved except gotten older. I read very differently now than I did 25 years ago. I read different things. I appreciate different authors. Some are the same, but boy, there's some that certainly aren't. And so the available dollars and the impact that that has on how you can evolve your collection makes a difference. The last thing I'll say is about strategic plans. Um, Again, this is just my opinion, so this may not necessarily be true, and I certainly worked for a lot of urban libraries where this wasn't true. But I will say, as a reader and the collection being our largest service, I didn't always understand why reading and the collection didn't show up in strategic plans. So if you can, tying all of this to your strategic goals, objectives, and especially if no place else, your values may not exactly show up in mission and vision. I would argue it maybe should if this is your largest service as well, but it definitely should show up in maybe at least one objective of what you're trying to achieve. But more importantly, by putting it in mission, vision, and values, it's really providing the foundation and the framework in which you're going to hang your collection as a service. So collection management is really collection development and then the kind of deaccessioning, weeding part of it. So that's why I like to call it collection management, because certainly the really fun stuff is getting to read all the reviews and hear about new books and hear authors speak and decide which of that mix is going to be great for your community. But the other side of the coin, I would argue, is equally important. We're not going to talk a lot about weeding today, but it should be in your policy. But that's really for the next class. So when you take all of these things into account, the community snapshot and your collection, that's where I like to call it's really not collection development, it's connection development, right? We want to build those bonds. It's not about the stuff, it's about the humans who are going to use the stuff. So really, I'm talking at a very high level here. And again, the practical pieces are going to be more in the second class. But if we can keep that the community and the collection connected as they both evolve and may evolve in slightly different ways, then again, evolution as opposed to having to face large leaps, I think will help. Not that you can always avoid a large leap. Some things are completely out of our control. So let's talk a little bit about this connection development. The ultimate question for me in this point of the conversation is why? Why do people still check out things? Why do they still want physical materials, not just digital or just podcasts or just reading on Facebook or Instagram or wherever you're getting some of your information? That has become, I'd say definitely the last 15 years of my career, that's critically important to not only us keeping collections going and keeping the right collection mixed together, but it has become an even more important piece of the conversation, not only with funders, but with the community itself, regardless of whether they use the library or not. So we really need to think about that role and starting with that big picture. And again, keep your finger on the pulse, keep looking at that. But part of that snapshot and part of that constant checking in is looking beyond the basic data. And in Minnesota, I would call the basic data that if you're a public library, we send in by usually April 1st, all of that information we send to the state. We have to do that data report, right? It's our annual report to the state. But if you do an annual report to your community, that may not be the same information that they want or need. One of the things that we have found very helpful, and it actually upped this data point, was how many holds are placed every year. Wasn't necessarily something that the state was wondering about, but we sure were, because it seemed so much less than when I came here, it was less than any other place that I'd ever worked as a percentage. Right? So there just weren't, which meant a couple of things. One, for whatever reason, which we needed to figure out, people weren't placing holds. But two, they had a pretty good circ. So were they all browsers? And if that's the case, what kind of services, collection-driven services, do I need to provide in order to help that browser? Which, as we all know, is much more complicated because they tend not to come to us. And again, we'll talk about that more in the second class. So trying to find out how and why people are using your collection and where they might perceive holes in your collection. is really important. And we want to do that anecdotally, but where we can, we want to back that up with our own observation or what people are telling us with any kind of data that we can find. Sometimes that involves a little bit of math, and if you're like me, you came to libraries, so you avoid it. You were hoping to avoid math. Unfortunately, that's not always the case if you're dealing with data. So as I mentioned, I consider development and management two sides of the same coin, and they have to work in conjunction, and they too have to speak to each other. But the critical piece for me is the transparency. They are entrusting us with significant, in some cases, significant amount of money. For most of us, actually, collection dollars are second only to staffing dollars. And if you looked at what amount of staff time, which translates into money, that we spend on this, whether it's reading those reviews, placing orders, doing the processing, checking them out, checking them back in, weeding, all of those things that probably at least half your staff, if in small libraries, all your staff has a finger on, means significantly amounts of staffing money is actually attributed to collection development. So it's a significant portion, and transparency helps taxpayers and funders understand that it's not magic. We don't have wonderful collections because we waved a wand and said, ta-da, this is what happens, right? I know, even subconsciously, so I'm trying to make it conscious for you, when you go through, you're constantly saying, oh, this is a wonderful book. Who in the community is going to read this? Will there be enough? Okay, it's okay when books were $24, $28, but now that some fiction are as much as 32 or 34, and boy, cookbooks don't seem to be under $45. Yes, we get discounts for those. You start to think, can I afford only 2 circs on a $50 book, and I'm weeding it 5 years from now? Sometimes we don't know that, but if we have a good thought of our community, we know a little bit and can make some educated guesses about that. So I would say every opportunity that you have to talk about all of the work that it takes to build the wonderful collection, and frankly, the joy that you get from and your staff in getting to create this wonderful collection will help them understand why you need additional dollars in your budget to accomplish those things. And related to that is, the old movie line, if you build it, they will come, right? Field of Dreams. That's not been my experience in libraries. We have to be better about touting it. One of the things that we do is we spend a lot of time building monthly displays. And on Instagram and Facebook, we've started throughout the month taking a picture about each of our displays that we have. And we have gotten some of our Facebook users will come in specifically to look for a display that we've put up. So we've made that connection, because if you're only doing things in your library, not telling anybody outside your library, you're only capturing those people who come and use you, which are quite a few, but this is a way to do more. But I think it's really important that especially your funders and your community know how hard we work to make these collections as wonderful as they are. And specifically wonderful for your direct community. It's not just this vague public library collection. It's a community-based collection. So I really love this quote, but I'm going to say that I don't think that there are any bad libraries. If you're building a good collection, that's a good thing. But I think what he's trying to say is that's relying a little bit on if you build it, they will come, that you don't necessarily need to tout it. And it's built on no context, right? You're just building a collection without thinking about anything else, just that this is a wonderful collection. But is it a wonderful collection and the right collection for your community? So I think that's what he means by that. And I would argue that without knowing any of you here today, that none of you are doing that. At the very least, you are building great services. And again, not everybody consciously thinks of the collection as a service, but the collection is a what I call a big S service. And then those smaller things that are small S services that drive that larger big S service. So in order to have good reader's advisory or good homebound service or even good displays, you have to have a good collection that speaks to your community. So again, I think everyone's probably good libraries, just not necessarily thinking about it as a service. But I would argue you're already all great libraries. So I said at the beginning, you may not consciously think about what you're doing and what context you're putting this wonderful service, but you are doing it subconsciously. All this training is doing is getting you to step back from that and really think about this as you are subconsciously as a service and how this responds to your community, but also that evolution of your community, how that is impacting your collection. So this is a good place to just take a breather. What questions or comments? Is there anything that Bethany in the chat?
Nope, nobody has put anything in the chat. But since it's a small group, why don't you unmute? And this is your chance to kind of just quick anything you've been thinking about that you think is a question you'd like to add right now. And I have a question. If you can't find what you're looking for in Compass, or if it's something kind of granular that you want, Michelle, how did you gather data? Because I agree. I think right now we're at a point where if you don't show up with very concrete data, it's hard to even discuss funding. So how did you find out data about Marshall? Because I don't know that we have much that we can access online that's easy, to get what you want. What did you do here?
So one thing that's been a struggle for me here and may not be a struggle for others of you in your communities is the school district, or if you're a county library, multiple school districts, because their funding really partially state and or federal funding relies on very specific data points. They collect that, and it's collected sooner and faster, obviously, than census. Census is every 10 years. Every 5 years, you might be a American Profile, that thing that the census does on the 5 year, but not every community, especially smaller communities, are part of that. So looking at data that the school district sends to the state, talking to your school district. If your school district is responsive, small, you happen to know a principal or a superintendent, which many of you probably do, you may be able to find some information there. The other place is your city. Talk to, if you have a city administrator or a county administrator, talk to them, make an appointment, and have some specific questions in mind. Anecdotally, this is what I'm seeing. Do you have data that backs that up? What kind of things are you seeing at that county level and that state level? One of the data points that shouldn't have surprised me but did was homeownership. Almost half of Marshall actually rents. So a community this size, and part of that is because we have a college. So I get that, but that's not completely the case. And one of the things that I've learned here in Marshall, but relatedly, is my own life I can look at. I've been a homeowner in the past, and I discovered I'm a terrible homeowner. I just am not very good at it. I'm a vastly better librarian than I am a homeowner. And
we've shared this before because
yeah.
I rent when I'm here too.
Yeah. So I rent, and I rent on purpose. It's not that I'm renting to save. Taxes have changed, so that has played a part. I live in a duplex, and my next door neighbor is an older woman. When her husband passed away and then she retired, she had been a homeowner for 40 years and she sold her house. And she said, they tried to put me in another house, downsize it. She's like, I don't want to do that. My husband took care of that stuff. I want to make a phone call and say the refrigerator isn't working and have that happen. So I also think the concepts of home ownership are changing. And, I have to think about why and what impact that might have. But for some people, that may free up huge amounts of time that they can use the library more, read more, whatever that might look like. So it may be an indirect thing. But I think talking to various people in your community, not just looking at their website or what they send to the state, which is critically important, but to get those stories behind that or to get to that granular context, if you will, I think it's helpful to talk to other people who data is important to in your community. And then, of course, every state has a data center, and Minnesota has one of those as well. And Compass as well are very willing to send them your questions. They may have some ideas for what you're looking for that you can't quite figure out. So, good question. Any others?
I'll add that I put the Minnesota Department of Education Data Center link in the chat, and I use the data reports and analytics to look up things like languages, to see which county schools fall in, things like that, which is important if you are talking to your schools about library cards for students. You need to figure out is the district office in this library system or in this library system. And so on. So if you want to try playing with those reports, at first it's intimidating, but it's worth messing around with a little bit because I think once you've used a few of the reporting tools there, you can find answers a little bit easier than you would guess.
And I will admit there are some frustration points in Minnesota in particular. Other states that I've lived, for example, the school district is required to send out an annual report to the taxpaying citizens, and it's not required here. And in my particular school district, it is difficult to get that granular information from them. I can get the bigger information from the state that they send, but sometimes it's difficult. And sometimes we've gotten that information not from administration. We've had to go to direct teachers to get some of that, at least anecdotal information. So it's not always easy. The other thing in Minnesota that is wonderful, and this is the one dark side, if you will, if you're a data person, I don't mean that in a bad way, but is the regional library system. So I've been here 10 years and I still struggle with figuring out for our library service area within Plum Creek, which is Lyon County, except the people who live in the city limits of Tracy and Minneota. That's my library service area. And trying to find out the saturation point of percentage of people who own a library card is sometimes very difficult because we use open source ILS system, and it's sometimes difficult to get what I've used in the past in commercial ILS systems, get that kind of information out. Slowly they're evolving, so I'm getting more data points out, but sometimes that's really difficult to find out. And especially I would think if you're in a consolidated region where let's say all 10 counties are operating as one library system, to find out what your saturation point is in your particular service area, which is likely your county, that's sometimes not easy to do. Any other thoughts? All right, let's move on. So how do we go from those snapshots in the community to drill down a tiny bit and think about our collection? So really think about that snapshot, then all the data that you've collected, both about the community, but also about that library use. Who is using you and who might not be if there's significant portions of your community who aren't. So that's creating that context by which we're now going to set the collection itself. And so now's the point that you're beginning to think about how's the collection, what's its role, what's its impact, but also then what's that going to then lead to your policy, what should be in your policy, how you want to approach those particular things. So again, at the very high level, we've been at the high level with the community, but now you want to be at the high level with your collection. So not thinking about the process. It's sometimes if you're the person who does the process, does everything, process, ordering, but also has to think about the policy. If you can, try to remove the practical tidbits of this, right? We want to think very high level. And what's our philosophy? Today, one of our philosophies are we continue to purchase physical materials. Even as digital materials have grown, and certainly I think I can safely say for probably every library who's here that offers a digital library, COVID really gave it that boost. People were like, no, I don't want to use that. Those people who were capable and had the technology but didn't really like it, they liked a physical book, they were able to adopt the digital, at least temporarily. So how do we think about why we continue to do that? What's our philosophy of continuing to purchase physical items, but also the philosophy is when do you let a format or a technology go? So when I got here, every library I'd worked at in the last like 3 to 5 years did not have videotapes. But when I got here, we had a massive videotape collection still. We even still had some cassette tapes, well into the era of the smartphone, right? So it was actually staff I had to work really hard with to let that go, more so than the community. So that mix of snapshot, talking to people, and our data from Koha was able to make the argument, again, not with funders, but with the staff, right? It's time to let this go. This is our time. And, for one of the things that softened it, especially for children's videotapes, was they said, well, we still have 2 or 3 families that use this. I said, offer them to take up to 10 of their favorite ones. They don't have to pay for it. Let them take them home, right? So it just, that helped get over it. But I think all the staff were shocked that they didn't have really, there was not a huge outcry when we got rid of that. So now we're having that same conversation with books on CD, right? There are many that we can't even purchase anymore, or we've got to pay for, say, Midwest Tapes to actually download it and rip it to discs and send it to us, which makes it a little more expensive. We haven't pulled the trigger, but we don't buy a lot of audiobooks in the last couple of years. But the data is showing that, and we've had a lot of people who have been very dedicated to it, want to listen to these 5 or 6 books, and we're like, we can't get them. There's no way for us to get them. And so they come in, especially after Christmas. Here's my device. I just got this, or it's a hand-me-down from my kids. Teach me how to do this because I really want to listen to these books, right? It's the incentive that they've gotten now. So,
Michelle,
yeah.
So here's a great question. So do people use data from their digital library to show library use and show funding needs? Why is it important to have a physical location? That's a question we get asked. And I even remember in school libraries 20 years ago, people saying there won't even be a physical library anymore. So is this example, like when you think about people who still want to use CDs, do you use that kind of data to explain why you still have a physical and digital collection? And because it is hard to justify spending. I mean, then you got to buy the boom box to the CD player too for people because
Right.
those don't work anymore. So yeah, how do you
Right.
do that?
The
Juggle
big,
between
big,
where
yeah,
are we headed?
yeah, that big leap happened when cassettes first and then CDs went away in cars, right? So, and it was really difficult. And now it's pretty expensive to have that after factory to add that CD player in your car. It's becoming more and more difficult. what we have done, and that I've explained is we dedicate less and less money to those because there's not as much available. Plus, as people move over, we offer Hoopla as well as Libby. Libby is part of our regional library, but we offer Hoopla, and Hoopla is completely driven by usage. So I only pay per use. So there's almost a million things in Hoopla you can check out, but I don't pay for a million things. I pay every month for what gets checked out. And as that bill gets higher every month because more people are using it, I have got to take money from our AV budget and our book budget to pay for that. And I look at that leap. This past year, we've had Hoopla for 8 or 9 years. That leap has always been from year to year couple thousand, maybe 2,500. From 2024 to 2025, usage was more than 5,000 in that leap. So part of that is again budget, driven by budget and things like that. The other thing, when people are coming up, we're explaining to them it's not being driven by our preference, it's being driven by the audiobook publishing world, that they are the ones who are saying we're only doing digital downloads now. And especially if it's books that have are with a smaller audiobook publisher, or being self-published. There's audiobooks being self-published now, just not just books. And those tend to be a little more pricey. So again, you got to look at the budget. We have a lot of people doing this. We offer Hoopla and Libby. We understand the frustration you have, but it's again, it's an evolution, and we're being transparent. We're making it clear. We're just saying this is what we're doing. We're buying what we think will be really popular that we can still get as a physical CD. Is that answering the question?
I'll let Felicia answer that. Is that what you meant, Felicia, kind of? Why don't you go ahead and ask? Just unmute. I think everybody has the ability to unmute. Would you test it anyway for me, Felicia? And
Yes,
I'll make sure.
luckily I do
Okay,
actually
good.
have a mic today. And mostly how to use the data of a digital library to argue for the need of having a physical library, where it's like, hey, we have these increased usage for the digital collection. How can we use that to, being like, hey, we do still need funding for a physical library.
Right. Yeah, for audiobooks, that becomes a little more difficult because you can't purchase it. Again, it's being driven by the publishing world, not by your choice. And you can continue, just look at the data that is coming from both your digital offerings, but then also your physical offerings. So if you still have a fairly significant, say, we offer digital and look at all this circulation, but look at audiobook circulation, it's still pretty high. So this is why we've got to continue, at the very least, to maintain it. We're going to continue to offer it. We're giving it space. We're going to continue to clean them when people say they can't play it, whatever that looks like. In our community, this is still critically important. So we are spending money on it, just not necessarily purchasing as much, but we're still purchasing, let's say it's $1,000 every year of the things that we know will be popular and we can still buy as a physical. And that's where that data helps you leverage that. We had that conversation more so with DVDs because prior to COVID, DVD circulation had really tanked here. And we had a good sized collection, especially maintaining older movies. We also had a family video, so we weren't seeing as much. So a couple things happened right before COVID or during COVID. The first is that our family video went away. So especially for those slightly older movies, they would come here because they wanted to still see whatever it might be. But the other thing that happened, so DVD usage did not go up during COVID because Netflix in particular was offering great deals, Disney Plus was offering great deals. They were capturing that market. But outside of COVID, 2 years later, I will argue that they squandered away that goodwill, if you will. And now everybody and their dog has a streaming service. So the whole reason people were cutting the cable cord was because you got all this stuff you didn't want and in cable, right? Well, now cable is doing more a la carte, so you can get just the channels you want. And and to me, streaming has gone cable, right? Every single thing that I have to get 12 different streaming services, and some of them have gotten pretty ridiculously expensive and still show you ads. So I think that there is really it didn't show its promise. It has not followed through with its promise. And so our DVD circulation has actually skyrocketed in the last 3 years because of that. Plus, as Amazon Plus and Disney and Netflix are now making their own shows and movies, and that's what they want to promote. And somebody's like, but I just want to watch The Mummy and The Mummy Returns. Who has that? Oh, I have to get Paramount to do that. So they're really pushing the new stuff, but apparently here in Marshall, we have a lot of people who want the old stuff. And we do whenever we can, like we've been able to purchase The Crown. They put it out, but depending on who the distributor is, Amazon, when it's their own distributor, Hulu too, they won't put them on DVD. So people come in and ask for popular stuff all the time, and we can't get it. So that might change. Seems to me that they like money, so at some point they're going to realize people are watching, uh, these shows, and it's not compelling them to purchase their product as the streaming service. So we'll see.
Patrick, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. I was just curious, you mentioned Hoopla. We've discussed it many times over the years in St. Paul and have always come to the conclusion that we can't budget around a pay-per-use where we we can't buy a certain amount. I know there are certain limiting options it gives you for uses per month or whatever. But also the cost per use is substantially higher than what we'd get on an equivalent physical item. So I'm just curious about the decision process that goes into that, adding something like.
As a smaller library, Hoopla offers so much more than we can get. And I know Hoopla has worked hard to keep that cost per use down a little bit, but in a smaller community, we can control that a little bit. But you're right about the budgeting. It is really difficult. About 3 or 4 years ago, we were offering 8 circs and we went down to 6. But if we go any lower than that, both my funders and my board, even though there's so much more library offers, we're living and dying by circulation still to a certain extent. So when they talk about trying to control that more, only spending X amount of dollars, let's say $2,000 a month. Well, our bill is between $4,000 and $4,500 a month. So right there, I'm going to lose a ton of circ, and that's going to impact my bottom line and my bottom story of this largest service of the collection. And a number of things that are just coming out digitally. ILL is no longer the super long tail. We cannot necessarily get materials from St. Paul when their only copy is a digital copy, right? Digital copy doesn't work that way. So again, to offer a wide variety of things, we've done that. There are ways that you can control that. And I believe Hoopla has started a more consortium-friendly concurrent user, similar to what Libby has. And I don't know what the expense is for that. For the really high expense circ, in the dashboard, I can go in and remove those from the collection, which we have. We don't really check out the $5 movies, right? So I've taken those out of the collection. I don't pay $4 to $5 for a really old abridged audiobook. An audiobook of our Hoopla audiobook is anywhere from 50 to 60% every month of our checkout. And our Libby collection can't keep up with that. So that's how we think about it. But last year and this year, I will be taking money out of the physical book budget, the AV budget, in order to cover that. But what I do like about it is it's customer driven. I don't have to guess if somebody's going to check it out in Libby or in my, my physical collection. They get to choose that they want that particular book. So, but it's a tough call. That I think that's why Hoopla continues. There aren't a huge number in Minnesota who offer Hoopla. All right. So I'll talk a little bit more about this, and then we're going to take our break. But in that second bullet point, I've listed some other items to talk about when you're talking to community and funders. Again, part of this is that transparency, but part of it is making sure that context is there about why we offer Hoopla, for example. I think Patrick's brought up a great point. I mean, it can get very expensive if it gets very popular. And some of their most expensive stuff in there is audiobooks. And that's why ours. But we're a community hub. People come from surrounding counties to work here in Marshall. We have about 10,000 people, more during the day, during a weekday, than really live in this community. So we do have a lot of people. Now, we do limit that. You have to be a Lyon County resident in order to use Hoopla. We don't offer it to all of Plum Creek, but we can offer it by limiting it by barcode prefix, right? So Tracy, Minneota, and Marshall Lyon County Library, our 3 buildings, have access to that. But one of the top things, it's one of our values in our mission, vision, and values, is that we're good stewards of public money. Again, it's that transparency. We are spending huge amount of thought process, work process, as well as the physical money to buy all these things, that we've always think about how that money's being spent, and that transparency helps it. Don't take our word for it that we're good stewards of public money. Here's how we're doing that. But we also want to be responsive to the needs and wants of our community. And they can be very different, needs versus wants. And sometimes wants have to fall by the wayside if we don't have enough money, and we've got to cover needs first. Because that that's going to impact the budget. But when you slice it down, just looking at a collection budget, you're slicing it down even further. And as I've been harping on this whole hour, it's a significant portion of the budget, especially when you put staffing in there. But there's also the ongoing expectation, particularly in times where money to the households is not as high. So for years since COVID, we were bucking the trend at our circulation rising. And we would look across the country, libraries our size, libraries bigger than us, smaller than us, and they were losing significant portions, especially of their physical budget. We're losing a little bit, but our digital budget was more than making up for our slight physical losses. So in some ways, we've created a monster, right? We've created an expectation that we are responsive to the community, that we do evolve our collection. We are constantly talking to them. We do surveys. We ask them at the desk. We observe at the desk, and that gets shared in meetings and things like that. So and again, that to me goes back to the first, that we do all this so we can be good stewards of their money. What they do give us, we're really trying to get every dime to scream. And I will say that I've told the community here, no other organization makes a dime stretch further than a public library. It's just the nature of who we've always been and who we continue to be. So as I said before, I think it's important to have it be part of the strategic plan. One of our our strategic goals, last strategic plan plus this strategic plan, has been making community connections with our collections. And we're doing that in a variety of ways. But also that it's part of our values in particular. We value reading. We value literacy. We value that they give us money, so we're going to be good stewards of that. And last but not least is we've given you all of this information. So this first hour has been about a whole lot of stuff, right? To create that context, to create that community snapshot, to create that snapshot of your library and who's using it and who isn't. And we've been thinking about that. And now we're thinking about the high level of our policy that says, why do we do it? What's our philosophy? What's our approach? And really drilling down, what's the purpose? What's the purpose of continuing to spend public money this way? All right. Any questions about any of that? All right, then let's take a break. I have 10:04. Let's assume it's 10:05. So let's come back at 10:15, 10-minute break.
When we get back, everybody, I'll be putting in the chat a link for you to record your attendance. So I'll mention that again when you come back at 10:15. All right, grab your coffee.
It's just the nature of libraries, and it's the nature of collections. So here are the basic policy sections. And all of this here works together to establish why and how. So your purpose is the why. It includes your philosophy of building the collection and your community connection to that. Throughout this, I do have my policy here. So if you have questions and you're wondering kind of how I'm approaching that, I can certainly share that. My collection is also online. So if you go to the Marshall-Lyon County Library website and click About, there is a policy section, and this is in the policy section. Again, for me, that's part of that transparency. So I'll state also at the beginning, there's no such thing as stealing, right? You borrow, and that's okay. Much of my collection is borrowed, especially when I have trouble stating exactly what I want to state. I go look at an array. I have my little laundry list of libraries throughout the country, and especially here in Minnesota, that may or may not be the same size as us, but I really like their approach to things and philosophy. So I'm like, what do they say about social media? I got to write a social media policy. So I do a lot. That's how I do a lot of research. And I will take tag phrases and whole sentences from places, and you should feel free to do the same. But I do have mine here, and so I can talk a little bit about using my library as an example, or answer any questions that you might have. So for me, in my high level philosophy, I have hopefully put together well that context and why we do this. And I even have a partial quote from our strategic mission, really what we're trying to achieve, which we encourage reading and learning and exploration of ideas. So all of those things, to me, need the service of the collection as a foundation to achieve those things every single day. Our purpose is really about making real our mission, vision, and values through the collection, what we're trying to accomplish, and why we continue to spend money on physical materials. So my purpose is just one, maybe 3 sentences, a small paragraph. So the other thing I'll say about these sections don't necessarily have to be huge, right? They can be as little as a sentence or 2. And then you're going to write the objectives. Why, like I, at the beginning, did learning objectives. Why, what's the purpose? Again, that high level, but here's how more concretely, what we're trying to achieve. And in this policy, more so than others, I really talk about this as being led by our library board, and that the staff as part of that is trying to achieve these things. Our very first one, especially important today, we rearranged these a little bit after all the book bans a couple years ago, is we value the freedom of reading, right? We want them to know that it's your right to be able to read what you want, how you want, when you want, and for most of the materials, in the format that you want. So really, that's what your objectives are trying to reach with this policy and with having a collection. Sometimes it is also about what you may not be doing or what you may not, and that might be temporary. Best practices says even if you don't change it, you review your policies every 3 to 4 years. So we just reviewed our policy in November. I did change some things, I clarified some things, and we took out a section where we no longer purchase, I can't even remember what it was, but again, like if you're not going to buy audiobooks anymore for a short period of time, that may need to be in there. Really what you cannot any longer achieve. Any questions about this high level of your policy? Okay. So let's then get into the heart of the policy. So really the heart of your policy, and this is the critical piece in a book banning world, right? A book challenge world, is how do you choose those materials that you're buying? How do you choose between digital versus a physical book, right? So selection of materials is likely to be your longest section, and it can divide down into smaller subsections, but really this is the heart and what people want to know. You didn't buy the book I recommended, how come? This helps you explain why you didn't do those things, right? So basically, this criteria helps manage what people really want, and we never have enough of, we want more of, versus the budget constraint, and having a well-rounded collection. I'll address the elephant in the room, which is we want to have diverse collections. Right now, it is critically important, but it's also being talked about a lot for the last 3, 4, 5 years, appropriately so, about having diverse voices in your collection, fiction and nonfiction, having a well-rounded collection, which includes a wide, diverse, not only in who's writing those books, but who is being represented in those books. So then you have, again, budget constraints. I just had this conversation yesterday with my city administrator about how much we purchase to have a diverse collection versus that really popular stuff that everybody wants, and how diverse is diverse for our community. We certainly have immigrants in our community. Many languages are spoken in our community. But unlike a few communities in our region, it's not over 50% who represent those people, right? So we've got to always think, because I don't have a lot of money. And that's another way that Hoopla helps us. It explodes our diversity, especially books in other languages. So, right? So this is important in how you are doing this work, and then setting that out in what you're thinking about. Again, I know you're doing this, but now you just have to consciously think about it. And think about why you're buying certain books, or putting up certain displays, or having certain programming in your collection. So again, we want to be diverse in all of those things, but what I tell my staff is I need a couple of other reasons besides we need to shake the community up. We need to push so they don't get so upset about certain things. And I'm in a very deep red area of the state, right? So I don't want to shy away from those things. I don't want to not do those things, but I also can't have the main reason we do it is to make a point. So we purchase a lot of LGBTQ materials, but we aren't necessarily buying a lot of the ones that happen to be challenged, only because those don't necessarily speak to the LGBTQ in my community. We certainly buy a lot of it though. And important to me is we make a point. I think Pride Month is critically important, but Pride year round is more important. So every display we do, if there's an opportunity, there's an LGBTQ array of books that's not about that. It's about these other things, right? So again, this is where the collection policy and that context helps you in articulating what you're trying to achieve. So in general, you just want a laundry list of all the things you're taking into account when you select. If you have a lot of those, just for ease of reading and you to use it and give to the public, you can divide them down. So we have a general criteria point. So one of those might be format options, right? So what book do I buy in book, large print, eventually mass market paperback, audiobook? Do I eventually buy the DVD if it got made into a movie? What formats are available and which are most appropriate then for me to purchase for my collection? So, and general criteria, we do take into account publicity, critiques, reviews, awards, all of those kinds of things, right? But then the other area we do is we do content criteria, and that's specifically about each individual book, right? So objectivity and clarity is one of those things, right? And that's one of them that we look at a lot when we get a lot of requests to purchase self-published materials, right? So is it comprehensive? Is it reach what the title is promising? And then in terms of book banning or smaller presses that are not exactly self-published or vanity presses, but they really are representing a very small slice of what's being published in that area. So they're very topical usually. Like we publish gardening things. That's all we publish. That's all we do, and put out 4 titles a year. What we see of a lot right now is, again, because of the environment, we see a lot of far right and far left presses that get donated. So our first one under general content is competence, reputation, and qualifications of the author, illustrator, and or publisher. So that is the piece that really helps us when somebody donates and they're like, why aren't you putting this in the collection? And it's like, I can't verify this. There's no reviews. The publisher describes themselves this way as, you know, a arm of a white supremacist movement, whatever that might be, right? Yes, I want things on this topic, but I'm a little more comfortable putting in the mainstream press. The other thing I can argue, which interestingly has not, I haven't gotten smacked down for it, which I'm a little surprised about, but we buy a lot of conservative materials, books, audiobooks, the whole 9 yards. And usually within 3 to 4 years, I'm weeding them, and they usually have less than 5 circs on them. So they aren't getting this information from reading. And so when somebody challenges us and says, well, I'll give you these. If you don't have the money, I'll give you these books. And I'll say, so here's the data around it. And I can't have things that aren't circulating on any topic if they're just sitting there, right? So if they're not readers, I'm really going to stick to the highly popular authors, titles, all of that information. And they tend not to be ones that are recommended to us. Interestingly, it's not mainstream media conservative approaches that we get requested for. It's actually more liberal approaches, or, you know, Republican versus Democrat, usually not even extreme approaches, right? So when Michelle Obama's new book, we want Michelle Obama's new book. Okay, you know, I can say that certainly the Obamas didn't get a lot of votes in this part of the world, but we still have people who are requesting it. So some of that stuff, we just wait until we get a request, regardless of people's politics. And then we look at who's publishing, where are they publishing, all of that kind of stuff. So that's an example of content criteria. And then more recently, we added, probably, again, 5 or 6 years ago, we put a digital library criteria. We work as a group to get our Libby, so Plum Creek, we all pay money, and then committees order those things. But wanted, but when we added Hoopla and eventually Canopy, so often the criteria is more for the platform, not necessarily the content. So Plum Creek has the Libby one, but in ours, we wanted to put something down that talks about the platform because we have purchased 2 platforms that people come from. Special collections is its own special area. So this is a area where you may not have any special collections. But one of my primary approaches to this plan and how we order things is to make sure that people know this is an ephemeral collection, right? This is not a research library. This is not a corporate library. This is things that are going to come in and out of the collection. And many people in the community, including some of my staff, books are sacred. You never get rid of a book. You hold it. But again, budget and space, that's just not realistic. And so the main part of our collection is ephemeral. It comes in and out, and it talks about that in weeding. But in our special collections, and our major special collection is our Minnesota collection. In our Minnesota room, it does talk about that we generally, in this 9-county area, we don't weed those things. I mean, they literally have to be falling apart, and we would still try to get another really old copy to replace it because it's not as ephemeral as the rest of it. So because of that, the criteria is different. So take that into account. Do I need a special section? You may have a physical special collection, but how you and what you order is no different than what you've already listed, then it doesn't need to be called out. It's just what you may say. We have these special collections, but we use our general and content or our selection criteria that way.
Betsy asked,
oh,
is
good.
that the same as, do you have Minnesota authors? Do you use that same criteria for Minnesota authors, or is it just for that special, or define the special collection?
Yes.
Like, does that spread out as little fingers into the rest of the collection because it's a Minnesota author, but it's not in that room?
Yes.
Do you know what I mean?
Yep, excellent. And I think I've got it somewhere, but we'll skip over it. I'll talk about it now. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next class because it gets down to the practicalities. But yes, in here, it does talk about our Minnesota, and I've got a whole section that talks about it being a more permanent collection and how those things come to pass. Like we will never, in our Plum Creek region, somebody donated a book from the 1980s that is this church group's cookbook. We say right here, it's from this area. We will get it and we will keep it. We talk about that we put some things in archival materials, little pamphlets. Because Plum Creek, we get little pamphlets about Laura Ingalls Wilder and things like that. We put them in archival envelopes and that's what gets checked out. So it addresses all of that. And it addresses exactly the question, which is we have popular books and authors that go to the general collection. And then once they show up on my weeding list, I will move them to the Minnesota collection if they fall within that definition. And our definition is fiction authors who were born here, grew up here, spent significant time here. If you were born here and a month later your parents left and you never lived in Minnesota again, it's not coming in. But Joanne Fluke, who wrote the Hannah Swenson mysteries, she lived here till she was 18. She hasn't really been back, but these take place in Minnesota, and she's considered a hometown girl. So stay in the state of Minnesota. She's not from around here. So we have actually second copies of Kruger, Sanford, the Hannah Swenson books. So I'll take Gary Paulson. They have to take place here. Plus, they have to have that connection to Minnesota as a fiction author. So we don't keep all of Gary Paulson's books because many of them don't take place in Minnesota. We keep the ones that take place in Minnesota and not the others. I think we have one that he won an award for, and we kept that. Nonfiction, it just has to be about Minnesota. We don't really care where you're from, unless it's hyper local. And if it's hyper local, it may not even be about Minnesota, but we'll keep it. Again, that 9-county area gets very special recognition. So in our fiction, we actually have a professor from SMSU who wrote a trilogy about a science fiction trilogy, Living in Mars, and we have those books. They're not in Minnesota, obviously, but he's a hyper-local author. All right. So one of the important things that I find sometimes aren't in there is the nitty-gritty of how, and at least our library, we use a lot of review journals. We use mostly library ones, but I have somebody who looks through all the popular magazines and gives me a list of things that are in People and Cosmo and Real Simple that are being reviewed. But we're looking at reviews. Sometimes we don't. Again, the hyper-local stuff, maybe not. And then what tools do we use? We use a lot of award tools. We don't buy everything of those, but we're aware, especially in genres, which are popular here. That's another tools. We use their website. And then you may want to address whether you purchase from small press, self-published authors, local authors. So again, with our Minnesota connection, we kind of address that. But I have seen policies where say, we do not purchase any self-published books. I think that's changing, but if you don't do that, I would certainly put that in there. We talked back and forth about whether we wanted a separate section that says how we handled this, and everything we would have listed there is listed in our criteria. So we have not pulled it out, and we're not opposed to it, but it has to follow same criteria. And local authors, i.e. those hyper 9-county places, we don't necessarily use the same criteria, but in the Minnesota section, it talks about that. So here's some other, again, just very basic policy sections that I think everybody, no matter how small the library, should probably address. Again, it can be a sentence or two. Access and resource sharing, we're all about that. So it's another way, besides in our regional compact joint powers agreement or our regional policies, I think it's good to also have it in here that reiterates we're part of Plum Creek. Of course, we resource share. Yes, we send things throughout the state, and we actually sometimes send things throughout the country. Sometimes libraries will contact us. It's and most of the time we'll go ahead and send if it's not a rare, but they're having trouble getting anybody in ILL to send it, and so we do. So we also, this is where we get to put our intellectual freedom statement. We do not keep kids from checking out R-rated movies, for example. We do not put 50 Shades of Grey behind the desk in the Sports Illustrated bikini swimsuit issue. We don't do that. And we say in many policies, this is all out there. We do not limit your job as parent or whomever has to make that decision. So again, if a book challenge would come in and say, we don't care if you don't get rid of it, but it needs, these 12 books need to be behind the desk to be able to check out, that goes against this policy because we say we don't do it. So that's why I think every library needs to say what they'll do. You don't have to follow what we do, but you need to say, yes, we ILL, yes, we participate in our regional library system. Only briefly do you really talk about maintenance in terms of weeding. And again, repair is up to you, but we do talk sentence or two about repair, that we only do minor repairs, example of a minor repair. And otherwise, I don't have staff time to be doing a lot of that, and especially really in depth repairs on materials, and that we will use our selection criteria and popularity if we're going to repurchase it, or even if it's available for repurchase. So not a big section there, but you do want to address it. I would definitely address donations and requests for purchase, because I'm sure even the smallest libraries accept donations and will let people, there are super users in particular, hey, are you going to get this book? Or I found this new author, you might want to buy it. So again, it doesn't have to be in depth, but you do want to address that. And one of the things that I say, especially in materials, we follow our selection criteria. Once you donate it to us, I no longer will accept the little sticky note that says, if you don't put this in the collection, we want it back. I don't even look at it. I give it back and I say, take it back. That's too much time for me to have to do that for everybody. We used to do that a lot and we don't do that anymore. So again, however you want to address it, I do think it's a pretty critical piece. So one of the things we also talk about in donations is memorial money. So in somebody's name who's passed away, or even other libraries I've had, we would accept books for like Stan's third birthday. He loves car books, and we bought 3 car books and put a nice little, whatever that might be. But how we talk about it is we'll work with them to get what we want, because just because it's memorial, I can't put in a lot of stuff that either is not going to go out or goes against our selection policy and what we're putting in here. All right, last but critically important, not least, is a statement of concern. And in my time in libraries, this has changed. When I first started in libraries, it was called a challenge in our policies. Then sometime in the early 2000s, it changed to reconsideration, at least at the libraries I was at. And now, even before all the challenges, I would say in the early 2010s, it's now a statement of concern. We want to hear from you, but we're not necessarily going to agree with you. Whereas challenge and reconsideration, we're not necessarily even reconsidering. We're just listening to your issue with what you have. So it's actually,
Michelle,
yeah.
before you go on deeper into statement of concern, real
Sure.
quick, do you put stickers for memorial books, or how do you label them? And has that been different in different libraries that you've worked in?
Yes, it has. In kind of the urban libraries I've worked at, we just had one that had like our logo and was just and it was a plate. It wasn't a sticker on the outside or anything, but which was a sticker essentially, but it was bigger, and it was a plate that went as soon as you opened the book, you saw that, which also sometimes helps with weeding, right? So knowing that somebody had donated this in somebody's name, we tend to keep a little longer. Not that we can't weed it, but that we do keep it longer. At this library, we have let people help us in the design of that. We tell them it can only be so big, but we had a very large collection donated to us from a family who had a late miscarriage and wanted a lot of books about that grieving process, both for adults and children. So there were storybooks. I would say in all there's like 60, and they wanted it in the name of the child they had miscarried. So they wanted a quote and who it was from, and they wanted the whole family, every person. It wasn't just, can't remember the name of the family, but it wasn't just the Petersons, it was everybody's name. And so we did some designs, and we went through 2 or 3 renditions of it before we put that on there. And then we have a remarkable number of people who was like, well, I don't want to be sad, I didn't do this, so you're going to put something on there. I just want you to. So that's the first thing when we get donation money that is specifically in memory of somebody, we ask those questions. All right, good. So the first thing I'll tell you is keep it as simple as possible, right? This should not be a massive section. In ours, it's about a half a page. And really, it is mostly about the process. Here, if you have a concern, here's what you do. In my policy, it specifically talks about materials, but on the form, it actually has a place where you can check a display that you're disturbed about, programming, somebody we've brought in that you're disturbed about, as well as book, audiobook, DVD, whatever it might be. So the one thing that I've learned in this process, not because we had it, but because of listening to other people in the last 4 years who have had some regions have had a lot of requests for consideration, or in their words, we want you to ban these books, right? So give yourself enough time. We had only given ourselves maybe a week to respond, and now we give ourselves 30 days because we want to talk to the Intellectual Freedom Office at ALA. We want to talk to other libraries who have had these challenges. So we want to give ourselves enough time to do that. So we do. I need to keep my board informed. If they're unhappy with my decision, then it goes to my board. My board gets the final decision. And this can be anything from, I want you to remove this book, to, I want you to move these books from the children's department to someplace else in the library and not the teen section, which leaves the adult section. Or I want you to quarantine these books, which is what I think of when you put them behind the desk. Right? So there's a variety of ways that they may have the outcome. And it says, what's your hope is going to happen? What do you want the outcome to be? And because we get our funding both in the city and the county, I want the city and the county to be aware that this is going on. But we are an administrative library, which means they have input, they can say things, but my board runs this library. That's not true of all libraries. So if you are a department in your city or in your county, you absolutely have to keep this informed. And I need to keep my staff up to date because this could be part of a larger movement, right? Moms of Liberty, all those kinds of things. Or it could just be one family. That's the only concern I've had since I've been here. And part of the process is they need to read the whole thing and giving them the form. And most of the time they're like, I don't want to fill out a form. I just want to talk to somebody, right? So I sat down and I was glad we did because in fact, the way we had cataloged some of the things in the children's department, I totally agreed with them. I'm like, this is not where this belongs. You know, pretty visually explicit, not in a bad way, of where a baby comes from, shouldn't be in the picture books. Should not be in the picture books. It's not really that kind of story. So working with him and working together and talking to staff, we came to an agreement and they were perfectly happy with it's still in the children's department. It's still, and now when somebody says, you know, we're having a baby and I've got an 8-year-old and I need to have this conversation, we can go, here's the section, right? We don't say, okay, wait, we got to look in 6 different places and, you know, find this stuff. So not all requests to have those conversations have a bad outcome. And we certainly want feedback. We absolutely want feedback. But you have to train and coach your staff. Make sure that they know what this is. Make sure that they know on the website where they can find that. If you don't want them talking, you know, if not that it would show up here, but in the environment we're in right now, if the police show up, if ICE shows up, if a parent is, you know, the press is like, oh, I heard that Moms of Liberty in town and they want you to get rid of 50 books, right? Nobody gets paid enough to do that. That's my job. And if I'm not here, then they're going to have to be patient and I will get back to them. But I, you know, in our local paper, she pretty much knows now. She's like, it's a lot, unless she's on a really quick deadline and she'll come in. She sends me an email, gives me her deadline because she knows I need some time to, and sometimes I've got to talk to my board president or whomever else before I can talk to them. So they need to know what they can say and how to handle those things. Any questions about that? So we're coming up on our 11 o'clock hour. So we'll go probably a tiny bit over. We are till 11:30. There will be plenty of time for more questions and comments, but I'd like to talk just briefly about other policy considerations. Most of these will be for larger libraries who have more staff, but there are some that belong in a small library's selection policy because of their community or how they're addressing things. So I do want to cover it for everybody. So here are additional policy selections. One is staff roles and responsibilities. Ultimately, the buck stops with the director, even in a moderate size staff, which is what my staff is. It's not huge. It's certainly nowhere near all the urban libraries I've worked at. But I don't make 100% of all the decisions related to this. So I say there's a section there that says I can designate who does this, and I list 3 different areas where that designation is happening. And why? One is I'm not the final decision maker. That's our public services manager who does that. And then I have a person who does all the acquisitions, right? She's the one, we give her what we want to order. She takes care of that. She does 90% of the cataloging. And then we have other staff who wrap the books, but all of that. But she's responsible for the quality that goes out. So she spots checks things and things like that. So she's ultimately really responsible for the processing as well. And then we have, it happens to be our web librarian, who's also our teen librarian, but she's a trained cataloger and she makes the decisions where all of our nonfiction goes everywhere, whether it's children's, teens, or adult. And that's become critically more important because we don't 100% follow Dewey anymore. We can go down that rabbit hole in the next one, but I like Dewey. I do not want to go to Library of Congress, but I do not agree with especially history where things are put. And it is definitely a 1876 white male Western perspective. And that doesn't necessarily fit in our, and even just how people approach information anymore isn't how it is. So I really do have to have somebody who can make those decisions about where they go. Sometimes we have conversations about it, but we got to have that. Break down your criteria only if it makes sense. Like I talked about, we have general and content. We started at children's and teen materials, and then I found that every single consideration could be put in the general selection process. But that may not be right for you. You may need a separate selection. If it's different, no matter what it is, so the rest of it, digital library is a special collection, library of things. Many people have library of things now. We do talk about the criteria because almost exclusively we call it library of amusements, puzzles, binge boxes, video games, all of that 100% is paid for by other people. It is actually not part of our operational budget. I don't have the money for that. So I do talk about the criteria, and it says in there, these are mostly donations or grants or money from our friends that allow us to buy these things. So it's explicit that I'm not using taxpayer money to do that collection in particular. But if we were, and it was buying a puzzle was the same as buying a book, I wouldn't need a special section necessarily, right? Because the selection criteria would still do. So you have to decide if you break down your selection area in these various things. And that, of course, is for special collections. I talk about the Minnesota collection specifically because criteria is different and weeding is different. So it needs to be addressed. Last but not least, you have a lot of other policies that are going to touch this policy in particular. So I call it the C also that a number of our policies have. So in our case, our C also is we adopt the ALA Bill of Rights and the freedom to read and view. Those are ALA policies, but we adopt them as our own policies. And then last but not least is the library materials lending, right? So if they want to know what fines, fees, what doesn't get checked out in the Minnesota room, those kinds of things, those are actually over in our lending policy. I think I may have, I've reached the end, but I'll see quick if there's any questions before I talk about getting ready for our class in 2 weeks.
Yep, there are questions. So I have a question. I can't remember. When we offered this course last time, did you have your policy available for people to look at? Okay, maybe that's something you and I can talk about and we can send that out or have it next week or next time.
We can certainly,
a good policy because it's real concise. It's nice.
Yep, you can certainly send it out, but as I said, we make it available to the public. So
it's on the website.
Go there. Yep, I can, and I can send you that link. But basically, from our front page, go to About.
Yep.
And then Policies.
Perfect. Okay.
And list all our policies.
And then Felicia asked, do you have anything as a sample for press training for staff? That's hard.
I don't because it's a one sentence statement. You don't deal with the press. I do. It's really, that's basically what I tell them. And then sometimes I will delegate that. So we had a huge New Year's Eve party all day on December 31st. And they came and take pictures, and I made it clear to our children's librarian that the quote should really come from her, right? Some libraries I've worked at, only the director's name should be in the paper, right? Nobody else should necessarily be in the paper. I don't agree with that. You're doing the work, you're meeting, 75% of the people who are coming to this. I want the quote to be from you. Many of these related things to the collection, I will be part of that conversation, but I bring in our public services manager because she does make most of the final decisions about what's purchased. That's part of her job. And that public service is in there. I do back of house, and she really faces the public. So not a great answer, but it's what we do.
Feel free to unmute and ask your questions now. You don't have to put them in the chat. So.
I can promise you there are parts of this collection that I wrote. There are a lot of parts that I adopted from other libraries. And it also helped me think about like how I wanted to present it and how did other libraries present this information and things like that. So it's not just taking that information, it's helpful with other things.
Felicia, go ahead.
As someone that is new to Minnesota, one of the big questions for me with this training is the law with Minnesota and having this course. So I was wondering exactly more of those connections of what we are learning and what part of that law it connects to. Because we've been talking about policy creation. Is more that law connected to policy creation or the practice? And so just kind of understanding that a little better.
Sure. I don't know off the top of my head what the code number is for the it's basically called no book banning in Minnesota law, right? That's not the official name of it, but that law not only states who can order materials, but it also says you're required to have this policy. So that's why almost all the first class is related to policy because it is required by that law. But I would also encourage you to read, and I don't know if 138 is right. I used to know this off the top of my head, but it's the law that every state has that allows for libraries to exist in their state. And so, excuse me, what I like about Minnesota is it really covers all three layers, I'll call, of libraries here, plus the state library. So it covers public libraries. What constitutes a municipal library versus what constitutes a county library? We are a hybrid. That's why we are not just Lyon County Library. We are Marshall Lyon County because by Marshall, we are a municipal library by law in the code. We are by contract the rest of the county. And the reason we can't be a county library is because of Tracy and Minneota, who are separate, individual, run their own libraries. And so we can't be. That's why we have a kind of odd name that has both. And then it lays out for regional library systems, basically that if you don't belong to a regional library system, which I think there's 3 in Minnesota, you basically don't get the services. So we have one that's not very far away from us, and we have to charge them for a library card because they're not part of a regional library system. And then it lays out the multi-type. So it lays out what Bethany does and what Prairie Lands and all of that. So Bethany, do you know that general number? Is it 130?
Yeah, Juliana beat me to it.
Okay.
It's 134.51.
Okay.
Is that what you mean?
Yeah, and just look at all of 134 because all of that will describe
all of
the
134.
different how many board members, where the board members come from,
Yep.
all of that,
Yep.
which I think is very helpful and also may speak to, who do I need to be transparent to?
Yes, yes.
But
So, yep, 134, we put a link in the chat. So take a look if you're, like I said, like Felicia, if you're new, it's a great spot. Right there is going to be pretty much everything you need.
and is that where they put the book banning law, or does that have its
Mhm.
own number? Okay, good.
Yep, that's there. It's
Again,
in the
I used to know
134s. Yeah.
that. Okay, perfect.
Yep.
Great. Hopefully that answers your question, Felicia.
Hope so. Carrie, go ahead. Carrie,
I just want to thank you for going over your collection development policy. I printed ours out and I've been going through it as you've been speaking, and I'm happy to say that we've got a pretty good handle on it. But we don't say anything about the publishers. We talk about the competence, reputation, and significance of the author, but we don't say anything about the publisher, and we really need to. So I want to just thank you
agree.
for pointing that out, the importance of that, especially nowadays when there's so much self-publishing.
Right.
And that's just something that we're going to have to get onto when we review this. So thank you for that.
Sure. You're welcome.
Felicia next. And right before Felicia goes, I was just going to say, I'm really curious. That is, like you've said, this is like something changing and growing and happening so much now. Would you drop in the chat if you've had somebody bring a self-published item to you and wanted you to include it in the collection? Let's just see kind of what's happened. And then Felicia, why don't you go ahead while people are dropping that in the chat? And I'll add from my experience that yes, it's happened to me.
So with like the library materials policy part of this statute, I was wondering, does it like if there is a group of people that are in charge of like deciding what is a part of a collection, is it every one of those people need to have like meet these, or does only one?
So that's a good question, because that came up a lot while they were writing this law and then when it came out. So you may or may not know, being from Minnesota, these 12 regional libraries are divided into two areas. One is federated and one is consolidated. If you're consolidated, it means you're running like a large library system, so like an urban library system. And most of those have a department that orders materials for all those libraries across all how many counties they have. And really, you need one person, and they're hiring. I mean, so they were already in good shape. It was the federated with all these individual small libraries making up the region. So Plum Creek is like that. We each have our own director. We each have our own board. We all get to make those decisions for ourselves. That was where we needed to have somebody. Otherwise, there were some, Plum Creek wasn't one of them. There were some regions that didn't have a single library who had educated master's degreed librarian, which is how it's described in the law. So in our region, we had 3 or 4 of us who we could have hobbled along, but I don't want to make the decision for the small library in a different county. That didn't make sense to me. I don't know that county, so I'm just going to rubber stamp it, and that's not probably what they want. So so the answer is really, it just depends. Part of it depends on your region, part of it, what type of region you're in. Technically, I could have done it. I have the degree.
Online reading challenges, but it's kind of in the weeds.
But that's not necessarily true of all libraries, and I don't really order the books.
In the documentation, it says that they're part of self-directed activities. And for the last few years, we've been asking you to describe the self-directed activities that you're including.
There we go.
To
So did you hear that? Hopefully you heard that last part.
I did.
Yeah, because we could have gotten by with it, but I'm like, I purposely am not the orderer, the final decision on the vast majority. So I did have the person in our library who is the final decision. She took this class last year.
If you're curious, you guys, go ahead and take a look in the chat, because Patrick linked to the form that they use for authors to submit their own book for consideration. So you can see
Good idea.
an example of that. No problem, Patrick. Totally understand.
Yeah. And as I said, these policies are going to be different everywhere. So if there's a library you really admire, look at their policy. If there's a library that's down the road and a good size, you guys talk about this stuff, look at their policy and see how they've handled certain things. So while we're waiting for other people who might have more questions, these are just the suggestions. It's why we don't do it next week. We wanted to leave a couple of weeks so you had time to do this. So look at your basic community data. Ask some questions of the staff. If you're new or relatively new, ask other people. If you have access to a small library, a former director, or somebody at the city, ask some questions about how they view the community. What's that snapshot look like? And then get into your ILS and look at some of that usage data. Hey, I wonder how many people. And one of the things that it did here in Plum Creek is we had to give ourselves more shelving locations, because if you didn't use a shelving location and it was just an adult fiction, but you sorted out large print, it was really difficult to find out how much your large print was checking out, or finding out what a turnover, what's your turnover rate in that. So our smaller libraries, for example, use the children's area as their location instead of saying it's in children's picture books or easy books. It's in juvenile fiction. It's in juvenile graphic novels. And for helping to find where it is, your department might, your children's area might not be that big, but to get data out of it will become really hard. What's your most section in your children's? Ours, surprising, not surprising, our top 3 has the highest turnover rates is beginning readers, juvenile readers, which are early chapter books, and juvenile graphic novels. Those turnover rates are all over 5, which means a turnover rate is just the average of, you take how big that collection is, divide it by the circ, and it tells you. And the general rule of thumb is you want everything over 1, which means on average, everything got checked out once during whatever your time period is. But this is the first library I've had where we've had a turnover rate of 8, which means the collection is pretty small and it gets heavily used, which is good information to have. Make observations. Look at what's coming back. Look at what's checking out. Talk to people. Talk to staff. Talk to your public. What do they love about the library? What do they think might be missing? And what would their wish list be? That you may understand why you can't do it or have it, but what do they wish they had? And then just as Carrie mentioned, have your policy, review it. And maybe you're doing really good and maybe one small thing, maybe it's just so, and it's wonderful. But this is maybe giving you a different way to look at it. And again, look at another policy if you're like, boy, we're missing a lot of stuff. I don't know they handle this. And I know this library has this particular thing. So that's all I have. Are there any more questions?
Don't be shy.
So our next,
go ahead.
So our next class is in 2 weeks. So it's February 5th, same time, 9 o'clock here online. And basically we're going to talk best practices. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is going to be drilling down more concrete about some of those things, right? So how do you go about building the best well-rounded collection? How do you manage that collection? What happens when suddenly a collection doesn't get, turnover rates are important, or how much is checking out at a given time, because we can always tell when some area of our collection becomes a shelf sitter because we can no longer fit things in there. So that means not very much is checked out. Or in fiction, we just order a lot of fiction. So we've got to constantly be looking at, do we need to do some weeding? And that's the third thing that we'll be talking about. And then just the overview. Think of a question later, there's my email address. Feel free to email me. Otherwise, write it down and ask at the next class.
Thanks, Michelle.
Sure.
I dropped the link to record your attendance in the chat as well. And then I put the Minnesota Compass link in it. Again, that one's a little bit something maybe people have not used before. So the rest of the links that generally we discussed are available at the ALA website. So the Intellectual Freedom, the Library Bill of Rights. And then we put the link in for the Minnesota law so that you can find the statute if you'd like to read. And 134, all of that is an interesting introduction to how libraries match the statute in Minnesota. All right. Let me think. Is there anything else, Michelle, that I should be sharing?
I don't think so. You'll send out a reminder
Mhm.
right before, so
I
she'll
will.
it's
And
the
we'll
same
send
link, but
out
she'll send it again.
the note-taking sheet. We'll have another one for
Mhm.
next time, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
we will.
Yep. Perfect. All right, you can send feedback to me if you had things that didn't work well for you today. I'd love to hear about that. And then it'll be fun to really dig into the practical stuff now next time. There's so many good things to talk about. So come ready with your questions. Again, consider consider visiting Marshall. It would be in 4 weeks that we will be gathering at the Marshall-Lyon County Public Library, and we'll have great snacks. That's one thing I promise. I always make sure there's good snackies. Makes it worth it. So have a great rest of the day, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. Appreciate it. Bye.